as I say, it's a huge honour for us to throw this party for Ted. Now, of course, we couldn't throw a party for Ted, who amazingly is 70 on June the 17th. Doesn't look it at all. We couldn't throw a party, of course, without Ted talking to us. And so he did ask for a 5-hour slot. I kid you not. And he can justify why he would ask for 5, but we've sort of restricted. We have to be out of here by 7 o'clock, guys. I remember Ted's early catchphrase, if it was everything is deeply intertwingled. And I've used that a lot in my talks. And now we've got intertwingularity as ideas collide, is it? Yeah. Ted, the floor is yours.
Thank you. This is going to be something different from what I usually do. I'm tired of talking about computers and computer media. I'm so tired of it. But first, I want to thank a few people. I want to thank especially Marlene Malakote, my partner, for so much support over the years. Thanks to the University of Southampton, and thanks to you all. The fond memories here of the 6 months that I've enjoyed most in my adult life. Thanks to Wendy Hall for making this department such a nice place. I believe that the atmosphere of an organization is directly emanates from its head, and to the extent that it's possible in a UK department, Wendy makes this family-like. And thanks to people I've worked with, Ian Heath, Chris Gutteridge, Les Carr, I guess none of them are here tonight, oh well, and Rob Smith, and the lads from Nottingham. So I'll be 70 in a month. I can't believe that quite. Some say I seem younger. And the question is why? And it's as they say in biblical epics, because my work on earth is not yet done. You may have heard of my other work, especially the Xanadu Project, intended to empower creativity and understanding for everyone. Plus, I very much needed that software, and I do not understand why it is not at the top of everyone else's agenda, because everything else is so wrong. Electronic documents are so beneath contempt in their present form. But I don't want to talk about that. I haven't done remotely what I wanted to do because, like John Mauchly, my good friend who was one of the inventors of computing, he got caught making tools. When I started, I should have considered what happened to other people who tried to innovate in media infrastructure. Johannes Gutenberg went bankrupt and his tools were stolen by his son-in-law, I believe. Tesla, the inventor of radio. You thought Marconi was the inventor of radio? Tesla's patents finally won in court, and they were earlier. Tesla, the inventor of radio, died penniless, a ward of the IEEE Society. Farnsworth, the inventor of TV, was driven out of business. Armstrong, the inventor of superheterodyning and amplification, which made radio practical, tried to get FM radio going and finally jumped off the Empire State Building. Stubblefield, the inventor of broadcasting, starved to death and was eaten by rats. So I feel relatively lucky to be still standing. So is Douglas Engelbart, my good friend. We have different agendas, but we have very much the same attitude toward the way things are and how much they need change. Now, I think of myself as a generalist, what you call in this country a polymath. But when I was 14, I typed up little business cards that said, Ted Nelson, Nexialist. I got the word out of a science fiction book, Voyage of the Space Beagle by A.E. Van Vogt. A Nexialist was someone who finds connections. So I was already on my wavelength, and I continue to try to do that. So what I thought I'd talk about tonight is interesting connections. Connections that I find interesting. Also with the thought that even if you're a generalist, you may make a serious contribution somewhere. even where you least expect it. For example, I never expected anyone else to use the word intertwingularity, and there it is on the web. Alfred Wegener is a nice example. Alfred Wegener was a meteorologist, invented the weather balloon, but he came up with a hypothesis in a different field that took a long time to catch on. When I was 10 years old, my grandfather, who loved globes, he said to me, "Look at that. Do you see how the corner of Brazil fits into the notch of Africa? They've moved apart. They were once connected." And I said, "Oh, Pop, no scientist believes that." And we were both right. I was in tune with what the Popular Science magazine said, and the theories of Wegener, or perhaps the next guy, turn out to be now accepted. Okay, so I'm going to talk about interesting stuff and not talk about my own very much. So intertwingularity. Everything is deeply intertwingled, which is a portmanteau of intertwined and intermingled. Portmanteau being a neologism of Lewis Carroll. And the other part of the title I got from When Worlds Collide, which is the film in my entire life that moved me the most. When Worlds Collide, I think 1952 or 3, 1, 2, 3. It was produced by George Pal, a Czech producer who previously did the Puppetoons. Then he did Destination Moon, which was a surprise hit, and so he did When Worlds Collide. And the story of When Worlds Collide is this. Scientists see coming two mighty planets. They are named, for no reason that's explained, Belus and Zyra. And Belus will go past the Earth, causing great tidal waves and ruction. Then Zyra will dead-on smash us to pieces. What to do? We must get a breeding population off the Earth before Zyra time. And in this movie, the calendar is a character. It's you turn the page turns, it says 47 days to Belus, 102 days to Zyra. And finally get to the calendar page, it says Belus. And we see the great tidal waves, and there's a wonderful scene where they flooded Times Square. And the way this was done was that they built a Times Square about the size of this building of black blocks, and they flooded it in slow motion, and then they created mats that showed the water going around the real buildings, and it was wonderful for that day. But I accepted the agenda of this movie. We really have to get a breeding population off the Earth because the chances of the survival of this planet are not that great. And Zyra is coming, whatever it is. So now that Hawking has embraced the same objective, we're on the same page about that. I don't know if it'll ever happen. With the present NASA administration, it certainly won't. But the new space guys are dot-com zillionaires who are building their own rocket ships, and that may lead somewhere. Turn the page. Note-taking. I started serious note-taking in 1957. Why? Because I wanted to keep track of things. There were so many interesting things to keep track of, and if you don't write it down, it's gone, whatever it was. And so many people are full of vague recollections of ideas and factoids that they kind of believe in, and that's nice, and I wanted to do better. And so I started taking notes on file cards, and after I got into computers, by 1962, damn it, I wanted a machine that would allow me to type with one hand wherever I went. And we still don't have it. The result is that I have perhaps 1 million or more separate notes, all on paper of one kind and another, stored in different states and countries. And I don't like it. Oops, seem to have gotten the pages in the wrong order. That's nice. Oh no, there we are. Yes, they're in the wrong order. I was going to talk about education because it's so relevant to the issue of note-taking. Maybe I can wing it. Yeah, here we are. So note-taking is like pounding stakes in the ground. When you write something down, it gives you a point of remembrance. When you write something else down, it gives you something else to remember about a subject. And gradually, you accumulate, obviously not thorough, obviously not powerful, but knowledge that begins to be a start about things. I always feel that when I tell an expert something he doesn't know about his own field, that's something. It's happened a few times, even though my knowledge is very spotty in that field. Now, note-taking has, however, eaten my life, and in my darkest moments of the 1970s and 80s, I thought, well, if I die and don't get anything written, at least it can be sorted out by posterity, like the notes of Wittgenstein and Charles Sanders Peirce. But the real issue is to put it all together. And this is relevant to education. Education is a system of ruining subjects for you, and the last subject to be ruined determines your profession. Yet, it would be easy to fix education, very easy to fix education. The only problem is you could not fix education with the existing curricula, the existing buildings, the existing tests, and the existing people. So unfortunately, that's a catch-22. How to actually do it, I don't know. But what I propose is to start a high school according to certain principles. You see, students are prisoners. Students are prisoners trapped in a system of requirements and obligations. What we need to do is turn education into something much more like shopping. You see, shopping is often derided, but it is a form of research. Yes? You are finding out what is possible for your life. You are imagining different futures in which you own this or buy that or rent that. It could be skis, it could be a car, it could be education, but it could be a course you might take. But all of these are the choices you're considering as you amble through the mall. And while it's enjoyable, it's also exhausting. Now, we don't honor this enough. And we don't recognize how relevant this is to the way we should be able to study. You should be able, as a consumer of education, not a prisoner, to decide day by day what next to do in a large lattice of possibilities which can be tested and which achievements can be honored. But no one has taken this approach. Let's look at the extreme. History. What is the right order in which to study history? Ha, you say. You can start at the beginning, you start at the end, you start in the middle. Doesn't matter. And yet, in every curriculum in the world, they tell you what order to study history and who to take it from and what time of day. Now, part of this is that it's in order to keep the people employed and to justify the buildings and other things that are not really justifiable. So the high school I would put together would be one in which you're given a Chinese menu, 2 from column A, 5 from column B, of subjects you're supposed to learn, and then given resources to choose how and when you will learn it. The examination will be given whenever you go to Kinko's Kinko's is a chain of copy services, that some of which are open all night. And so now we've taken care of the exam problem. And in fact, it turns out, it will turn out, I believe, that education can be provided on a very different basis. Well, the high schools, of course, since it would be a, quote, remedial high school, anything goes, but it would be able to demonstrate the principles I speak of. So instead of a curriculum, a cafeterium. Let's change the subject. Let's take an entirely different subject, which I find fascinating. These guys are the brothers Grimm, and they gave you Cinderella and they gave you Snow White. It is not generally known how much else they gave you because, in fact, what was their day job? They were linguists in German universities, and they came up with Grimm's Law, which was that they noted how how consonants had shifted through Europe over various times. And this was the beginning of something else we'll be talking about. I heard a very amusing anecdote, probably not true, but I'll pass it on, because there are two forms of work. The fairy tales and the linguistic work are treated as unrelated. But the story I heard was as follows. What they were trying to do was map the different forms of pronunciation on a map of Germany and how they had changed. And of course, by now it was 1780, 1800, and the fast-moving modern world was swirling people around. So how would they find the people who had lived longest in a given spot? Well, they would go to the local storekeeper or tavern and say, "We're looking for old stories." And who would have the old stories? Why, the old people who had grown up in that place. And so, two birds with one stone, the linguists found they were in the business of storytelling. I don't know if it's true, but isn't it nice? So, the next thing that came along, in theory, about that same time, Sir William Jones, a British administrator in India, postulated an Indian origin for European languages. And in 1814, someone named Rasmus Christian Rask wrote an essay on the structured details of the postulated Proto-Indo-European language. And now that is widely accepted, that most of the European languages, the ones we call Indo-European, the Greek, the Slavonic, the Germanic, including English, the Celtic, all came from a common root, Proto-Indo-European. Except for certain languages. There's the Basques. I won't talk about them. I haven't researched it. And there are the Finns and the Lapps, who prefer to be called the Sami, and the Hungarians. Okay, that family, Finns, Lapps, and Hungarians, we'll come back to them. But what was really happening? And essentially, I'm putting this together from various things I've read, and I haven't read this in one place. What was really happening? How did the Indo-European language reach Europe? Okay, what was really happening was what I would call the big melt, because 8 to 10,000 BC, the ice above London was 2,000 feet thick, and similarly over Europe. Whereas the English Channel was a valley in which mastodons roamed. They keep bringing up the teeth from the English Channel among the flounders. And in any case, the big melt was when the ice went down and the sea level rose. And this had drastic effects for the movement of human beings. And it is almost certain, I think, that it was at that time, which coincidentally is called the end of the Mesolithic age and the beginning of the Neolithic age. Lithic, of course, means pertaining to stones, okay? Stone, axes, stone, this and that. So Mesolithic was the Middle Lithic period. Neolithic was the New Stone Age. In the Mesolithic period, they had little tiny knives, little tiny tools. And in the Neolithic, they didn't have to be so small. What happened? Answer, the ice melted and we came out of India, as far as I can tell. And the dispersion then into the different language groups took place 10,000 years ago. But wait, and this is the interesting part. This is my hypothesis. There was one group who was already here because they had conquered the snow. This is the best I could find. The people we call Lapps, that like to be called Sami, they had reindeer and skis and sleds. So they had mastery of a land that was closed to everyone else. And my guess is that they were there before the big melt. They were all over Europe. Because, why? We know why their language group is where it is now, but the larger language group, which apparently is related to, goes as far as Mongolian and Turkish. These thoughts were inspired when I read somewhere long ago, I couldn't find it now, undoubtedly in my notes, that a small statue of a reindeer had been found in Turkey that was 10,000 years old. I don't remember the age. And what kind of language do they speak in Turkey? Well, get back to that. Let's look first at the Finno-Ugric family. Now here, these are the spots, the principal ones, where they speak Finno-Ugric, i.e. those languages known to be derived from the common root that is that of the Sami and now Finland and Estonia. So we see Finland, and above there, that blue and white striped patch is a notional country that they like to call Sapmi, S-A-P-M-I. That is their name for it, the Sami people. But in fact, since it's partly in northern Norway, partly in northern Sweden, partly in northern Finland, and partly in northwestern Russia, it will never actually be a country. But that is where they retreated to. That is where the reindeer culture remained when the rest of the place had dried up. But we see the pockets. Look, Hungary, Finno-Ugric language, and other pockets of other Finno-Ugric languages all over. So the hypothesis I'm proposing to you is that the Lappish people, or Sami, ruled the snow and ice more than 10,000 years ago, before the Great Melt, when you and I, or our genes, walked out of India, probably through the Khyber Pass. Okay. Good. Let's go to more recent history. 1500 BC. And the most important event in European history. There is an island. Okay, here is Greece. Over here on the right is Turkey. Here is Crete. And right here is a little island that in this picture is U-shaped. This island called Thera or Santorini, those are both Greek names, and I don't know when you're supposed to say one or the other, is a beautiful tourist spot featured in a movie called Summer Lovers, which is kind of a very amusing movie if you'll ever see it. And for 2 millennia was the principal source of pumice and other minerals, first for the Roman Empire and later for Europe. And then in the 1860s, under the pumice, what did they find? A house. Now, let's talk about Minoan culture. Here is Crete. And when I was a boy, they showed me pictures of Cretan urns and Cretan figures, I guess. Minoan culture is named after the palace of Minos on Crete. And it was a historical puzzle why the Minoan culture had suddenly disappeared around 1500 BC. And the two forms of writing, Linear A and Linear B, that of course is the names we give them, we don't know what they call them. The two forms of writing abruptly died out. Well, in 1866, a French guy, missed his name, researched the houses under the pumice on Santorini, and guess what? They were Minoan. And the whole thing slipped into oblivion for 100 years, till a certain professor, Spiridon Marinatos, went and took a closer look. And it became clear that the volcano which exploded in 1500 BC and buried the houses was the biggest in human history, bigger than Krakatoa and Pinatubo and the rest combined. That the death cloud of hot ash probably killed everyone in Turkey, or the Anatolian Peninsula rather. That the tidal wave wrecked the northern side of Crete and did great damage in Greece and as far away as Egypt, I believe. Anyway, certainly on the shores here of Turkey. And Marinatos said, okay, we know what happened. The explosion destroyed Minoan civilization. And obviously, everyone who could read and write Linear A and Linear B were dead. I have a sample of Linear B here. Now, in the 1950s, that's Linear B. In the 1950s, a brash young linguist named Michael Ventris looked at it. People had guessed that it might be Greek, but it didn't fit. But he tried another way of fitting it together, and by God, it's Greek. They were speaking Greek before the Thera eruption. After the Thera eruption, they didn't know how to write anymore. How long does it take? If you've seen people read and write, for you, suddenly it's on your shoulders. You've got to do it. How long will it take you to figure out writing? Well, here's somebody who did. His name was Sequoia. We're not quite sure whether the tree was named after him. And I believe in 1821, having been apprenticed as a silversmith in the he sat down and scratched in the dirt, and it took him 12 years. And he kind of overdid it, I think 84 characters or something, but hey, here's a sample, kind of adorable. Those are some of his letters. And the Cherokee syllabary was accepted within 2 years and is still used by the Cherokees. So that gives us a sense of how quickly those who spoke Greek and had seen people read and write were able to develop the new alphabet, which coincidentally appeared about 1500 BC. Marinatus had another conjecture, a very charming conjecture. There was a legend in Greek culture of a land that sank beneath the sea. And perhaps this legend, whose only written record is in Plato, but if you go to Chicago, Greektown, there's the Atlantis restaurant, there's the Atlantis bakery, there's the Atlantis this and the Atlantis. Why do they care so much about Atlantis, especially if it was in the Atlantic Ocean, which is thousands of miles from Greece? No. I think Marinatus' conjecture that this was the original Atlantis, that was the name of it, is very likely. In which case, of course, we also know the name of the mountain. Could only have been the original Olympus. Huh? Marinatus also conjectured that some of the Greek gods could actually have been real people. Because you know how stories get conflated, famous names, stories accumulate, interesting anecdotes become attributed to the famous people. For example, the Turtles All the Way Down anecdote, which I heard first 30 years ago, I think, is now attributed to Hawking much more recently. So it's the sort of thing that if you're famous, people think it's you. So Poseidon might well have been an admiral. Charon might well have run a ferry. We'll never know. So I have one conjecture to add to this. Everything I've told you, except bringing in Sequoia, that was something separate. But everything I've told you has been from other people. But the conjecture I would add is about linear A. We note that even if the death cloud moved over Turkey, even if everybody here was dead, the next language that moved in was arguably related to the Finnish-Lappish group. So in other words, that's the kind of languages they spoke of in that direction. And linear A might well be of that family. That's a conjecture. Now let's talk about another linguistic hypothesis, a very romantic one. In conjecturing the existence of a Proto-Indo-European language, people were taking the existing languages and finding the similarities, and packing them together and recognizing how alike they were. So in 1903, a Danish linguist named Holger Pedersen proposed a language he called Nostratian, and two Russians ran with the ball in the 1960s named Vladislav Ilyich Svitich and Aharon Dolgopolsky. And they went forward with the Nostratic hypothesis, i.e. the hypothesis that there is one common language for all the languages of the Eurasian landmass, including ours. So that, in other words, takes the same methodology of a Proto-European language back many thousands of years more and saying there was one in common. Now, this has been greeted with a lot of doubt. But if we put it together with the recent researches on the populationizing, on how Eurasian landmass was populated, maybe it makes sense. Because they're now saying that around 75,000 years ago, we came out of Africa. If you say to anybody, where are your folks from? Where is your family from? Oh, you know, Ireland, Germany, Norway. Yeah, but what about 75,000 years ago? 75,000 years ago, basically, we were all in Africa. And apparently, the Exodus, the Great Trek, was a very small group, referred to as a genetic bottleneck, because the genetic similarity among Europeans and among Asiatics is, 99.9 or something like that. Whereas there's great genetic variation among the fully human persons left behind in Africa. So what they've mapped is a trek out of the Horn of Ethiopia, across the lower end of the Red Sea, which at that time will have been dry because of the glaciations, and around into India. And that's how we got to India. But of course, most of Europe was much too icy at the time. Anyway, all of this is extremely interesting to follow. But the Nostratic hypothesis that there was one language from which all of this came may yet find some justification in tandem with the genetic tracking of the movement out of Africa and around the Indian Ocean. So this is, it's all in Wikipedia. I have a friend, Jason Scott, who compares Wikipedia to a casino. And when you go into a casino, the atmosphere is very calm and quiet. There's the clinking of the chips and the soft music. And you don't see the security systems in the jails. Every casino has a jail. And the Wikipedia, what goes on behind the scenes at Wikipedia is this appalling slash and burn fighting over what goes in and what goes out, arguments among different kinds of editors. And he says, don't expect articles on Wikipedia to get better. But even so, I've heard Dawkins say, it's a miracle. So there you are. It's a miracle that won't get better. So how keep track of all of this stuff? Simple note-taking won't do it because of all the cross connections you have to keep track of. And that is one of the reasons that Xanadu structure always seemed to me the most straightforward structure. Now you see, there are two approaches to a computer problem. One is to say, what is the real problem and how should we really handle it? That way lies madness. And the other is to say, let's just throw in some stuff we've got lying around and no one will notice the shortcomings. And that's how we got most of what we have now. So I went the way that lies to madness. But the point is, from my point of view, to do the things that electronic documents should do. What they did was they imitated paper. In fact, they imitated paper under glass because you can't annotate it. Whereas when I was 14 and learning to write, the shortcomings of paper drove me out of my mind. I guess there are two reactions you can have. If somebody shows you software that you don't understand, laymen will say, oh, I don't understand technology. Whereas I will say, those sons of bitches. And similarly, when it comes to dealing with the problems of the shortcomings of paper, most people say, oh, I'm not a good writer. I say, no, this is the problem is not me, the problem is paper. Now, for example, when I was 14 and learning to write, and by that I mean learning to write big papers. In high school I wrote 5 or 6 papers that ran over 60 pages, I think. And it's a problem I have, which is that I want to say too much. But at the same time, the issue is clear cut. It's that there is no determinate order in which to say things. Writing is a process of taking lots of items, attempting to array them in a reasonable way, and making micro transitions among them, then changing it. And that is the process that used to be called cut and paste. Now, it's no secret that I don't like Xerox PARC very much. I believe it all went wrong at Xerox PARC. But what I find most atrocious about Xerox PARC is what they did to those holy words, cut and paste. I still do real cut and paste in my writings. Here, this is the manuscript for the talk I'm giving right now, where I printed out one version, cut it up, and I use staples, but that's a 20th century variation. The point is that deep rearrangement is required. My first salary job was at a small town paper called the New York Times. And I was a copy boy. This was somewhere between my freshman and sophomore years. And my first duty at 9 a.m. in the morning was to take the paste pots from the city desk, and I don't remember what the other desks were, and scrape out the crusty old flaky paste and go to a shining vat of iridescent new colloidal glowing stuff and go glop and slap it into the paste jar. And the paste jar had a little brush coming down the center from the top, and put those back on all the tables. In fact, I think it had a tube. That's right, it had a tube for the paste brush to go down. And the reporters would come in, they would type their stories, and then they would do cut and paste, which means that they would cut up the story and rearrange it. Rearrange it with all the pieces in sight, a parallel process, and then paste it in the new sequence. Now, when Xerox PARC created the modern computer world, you see, you have this crazy loyalty to Macintosh versus Windows versus Unix versus Linux. They're all the same. They all use the PUI, the PARC user interface, called by some the modern GUI. I would not dignify it with such a term. The PUI consists of a so-called desktop. Now, have you ever seen a desktop that was vertical? Yet the desktop of the computer is vertical. This is called a metaphor. A wastebasket or recycle bin in which you put whole objects that you wish to get rid of. So-called applications. What is an application? Well, let's back it up. There was a doctrine at Xerox PARC. They didn't like modal commands. A modal command is one where the cursor takes on a new meaning, or where the things start behaving differently. So they created the biggest modal commands of all. They're called applications. So when you go from one application to another, the cursor sure changes its meaning, but somehow that didn't fall under the purview of the modal command prohibition. Okay. Then you had the so-called clipboard. Now the clipboard on Unix or on Windows or on the Macintosh, the clipboard is an invisible object that holds one thingy. Now, there are variations, but the point is that there are no standard variations. It holds one thing, and it's invisible. So it's just like an ordinary physical clipboard, except that it's invisible and it only holds one object. And it has no other properties. So it's not like a clipboard at all. That word is used as an excuse for this abominable mechanism that won't stack, that will lose things. The moment the phone rings, you lose stuff. That happens to me all the time. It happens to everybody. And they excuse it with this word, the clipboard. And worst of all, they've taken those holy words, cut and paste, which refer to the highest faculty of the human mind, which is the reconsideration of large-scale projects. And they change the meanings to hide and plug. Cut means hide this thing, paste means plug whatever you've hidden. And this has nothing to do with cut and paste in the old sense. And I have people argue with me all the time. It's really the same thing. When you do a cut and paste, no, it is not the same thing, and it is a loss to the human race, and it has deprived us of decent writing tools. Okay, I'll simmer down. Now, okay, so let's, I shouldn't have talked about computers, but anyway, I'll go on here. So let's see then. Oh, good, still charging. So that is a picture of hypertext from my first peer-reviewed paper in 1965. And you'll notice that the connections are two-way. And there are two types of connections. Links, shown by the thin lines, and transclusions, shown by the thick lines. Transclusion means the same thing recognizably in two places. So that can be the origin of something or a reuse of something. Now, people say, that's not practical. Well, that was 1965. This is 2007, work I've done with Rob Smith and others, and here we are with exactly the same structure. But maybe you'd like to see it running. Where is it? Yep. So here we are. These are two documents side by side. I wrote this one on the left in order to tie together some other things, just to demonstrate the capacities of the system. And this pinkish thing is a transclusion from there, meaning here it is and here was its origin. But we can step between them. So now this becomes the central document and that becomes the companion document. So we have here in this front plane, this reading plane or firing line, we have a central document and one or more companion documents. Now, one of the problems of hypertext is the complexity of the links. Let's look at the complexity of some links. I'll fly down here. Yeah. So here we see some links and we're flying through them and it's very hard to see where they all go, right? So if we go back to this firing line arrangement, now we can see the particulars of what we're reading and then step to the next thing and watch it fly in from its position. So this is a solution that helps us concentrate on one page and at the same time see connections between a lot of other pages. I hope this will be a product real soon now. But putting it in 3D gives it a number of extra properties. One is that you can fly around. One is that you can see the links in this glamorous kind of way. I love flying through it like this. And one is that in principle, it will allow you to see a lot of stuff together and understand the relationships, because that is the issue. The point of hypertext was always, as far as I was concerned, to be able to understand really complicated relationships, not the dingy little one-way links of HTML. And I don't know if any of you saw my letter in New Scientist last summer where I apologized for any part I may have had in the creation of the World Wide Web. I said that when, in the system I was working on in '68, the Brown University hypertext system, I proposed that system of links where they're one-way, non-overlapping, and untyped, thinking that would be a temporary fix and get us off the ground, not imagining that 30 years later we'd be stuck with it. Because it's, as far as I'm concerned, well, it's far short of what we need for a true literary system. And by literary, I mean handling documents the way they should be. Okay. Moving right along. When I was 8 years old and allowed to walk to school on my own in Manhattan, I had to cross Broadway, Lower Broadway at 10th Street to get to my school. And there was a lot of truck traffic. And I kind of enjoyed being in the midst of traffic, always did. I still love to drive in Manhattan. And I discovered that if I turned my back on oncoming trucks, they would screech to a halt. And so I learned a fair amount about strategics from that. I think I always had a strategic sort of way of thinking. When I was in high school, I wanted to work for the Rand Corporation. Now I'm talking 1954. This was partly because of the influence of my mother's boyfriend, a guy named Leo Roston, who was a popular humorist, had written a number of film scripts, but was also involved with the OSS and the Rand Corporation. And I was severely perturbed about the danger of nuclear war and felt that I could contribute something philosophically to the whole issue and imagined that I might get a job there. That's not what happened, but I found out they only hire economists. Now, in 1959, my first year of graduate school, maybe it was, yeah. Anyway, in my first year of graduate school, I wrote a paper on the payoff of seeming irrationality, such as an 8-year-old boy turning his back on traffic. And it wasn't very well appreciated in my department, but I found out a few months later that it was very much the same paper that Daniel Ellsberg had written a few months earlier, his famous paper, of course, much better and much more academically credentialed on the same thing. So I always hung out with people in the military intellectual area. I first heard Herman Kahn speak, I think at the University of Chicago and then later at Harvard. Now Herman Kahn was a very interesting fellow. He was football shaped, very large, and very jolly, but he had written a book called On Thermonuclear War with such scary chapter titles as Will the Living Envy the Dead? From which I think the Grateful Dead got their name, but I'm not sure. And I interviewed for a job with him and Max Singer, and remembered driving around with this huge band in this tiny car, but they didn't hire me. I got a job with Dr. Lilly in his dolphin lab instead in Miami. There was a young fellow I was hanging out with, he was my age. We were both singing in the local coffee house. I was singing with my banjo, he with his guitar. His name was David Crosby. And we would hang out and read Playboy together and joke about thermonuclear war. One day he came to my house, saw that I had a shelf of books on strategy, including on thermonuclear war, and he seemed very perturbed because it was okay to joke about it, but not to take it seriously. I don't know. Someone should write a history of World War III. Now you say World War III didn't happen. Right, but every year from 1946 it could have. And what were the preparations and what would have happened if the war had been fought at that time? Now, I have lots of pacifist friends, but I always believed that deterrence worked, and I believe that the deterrent system worked. For example, Operation Chrome Dome. Now, I only heard of Operation Chrome Dome a couple of years ago, but in fact it's what you saw in Dr. Strangelove. Operation Chrome Dome was the continuous circulation around the Mediterranean of American B-52s ready for a nuclear strike against the Soviet Union, and a similar continuous circulation of B-52s ready to strike around the Arctic Circle. Well, thank God they didn't. And I think that's because the whole thing worked. And because people on both sides of great intelligence and great goodwill wanted there not to be a thermonuclear war. The Russians weren't stupid. Now, I took a strategy course at Harvard under a guy named Thomas C. Schelling, one of the most brilliant people I ever met. And I was very pleased to hear that he got the Nobel Prize last year. But it may very well be that Schelling saved us from nuclear war. I don't know, but here was the argument he said in public. Nobody wants a nuclear war. Neither side. No. No way. But we can't disarm. That would be foolish. And we can't strike. That would be insane. So what can we do that will tranquilize the situation so that decision makers will have every possible alternative to what nobody wants to happen? Let's begin with communication between both sides, ergo the hotline. And 2 months later, I was smoking again. So I went through this super resolution business several times, and obviously it grew stale. I knew I could not plausibly make such a resolution again, that I would smoke again. So sometime in I guess it was the 70s, I'm sure it's in my notes, I said to myself, well, what would Schelling do? Just as he said, we can't strike and we can't disarm. How can we get closer to what we want anyway? I said, okay, I can't go on smoking and I can't quit forever. How can I achieve the next best thing? Well, and also I can't smoke less than 4 packs a day. So make the smoking bouts shorter and further apart. Now, isn't that the only answer to that question? Okay, how do we enforce their being shorter and further apart? Well, could there be something psychological that will help me not smoke for a long period of time, say a year until the next smoking bout? What can I do to be continually reminded of how awful smoking is so that I don't take it up again for as long as possible? That decided, I found a mechanism that would allow me to end a smoking bout in such a way that I would not smoke again for a long time. But you have to understand the theory. I'll go through it one more time before I tell you the mechanism, because if you just tell someone the mechanism, they won't get it. The theory is you want the smoking bouts to be shorter and further apart, as short and as far apart as possible. Ideally, vanishingly small. So you want some way to remember, to make awful the recollection of smoking. Okay, that said, what is the mechanism by which I close a smoking bout? Answer, I eat a cigarette. Every crumb of tobacco. Not quickly. I'll take it slow, have a Diet Coke, whatever the hell. Wash it down with any damn thing. But it's so god-awful that the memory stays with me vividly for several weeks, and then abstractly for a year. So using this method, I have smoked only one day a year for the last 20-something years. I'm not sure how long. But if you say, do you smoke? And I say one day a year, you don't get the picture. And it's interesting, I've told this method to many people, and none of them have tried it as far as I know. They say they want to quit. Now, I went back and visited Thomas Schelling in his office at Harvard in 1987. And I said, what are you doing these days? He said, well, I'm not working on nuclear war anymore. I'm taking up issues of self-command, such as how to stop smoking. And it seems that because he had been a lifelong smoker, he lectures in high schools and everything on how to stop smoking and what a terrible thing it is. And I told him his method, which was a pure Schelling method that he hadn't thought of. He was gobsmacked. It was marvelous. I felt, you know, as if as his student, I had handed in an A paper. Okay. So, continuing on the subject of strategics, since that time of that 1959 paper I mentioned on rationality and how small boys can stop trucks, I've been very interested in creating a theory of general strategics, which involves particularly some sort of representation and calculus for parties who are aware of each other and aware of each other being aware of each other. And this is, and I've got thousands of notes on it, but no really unifying top level. Here's a nice example. Police informers. The police informer plex. Now, you're aware that there are people called police informers, but wait till you see the ramifications. And this shows the rich strategic relations which can be generated from simple premises. Much of so-called police work is really contacting informers. By the way, there's an extraordinary scene in The French Connection where Popeye has an informer that he's in touch with, but he's also beating him up. And yet they have this complicated communication where the informer is telling him what he needs to know while he's being beaten up. what we may call the police informer plex. Much of police work is dealing with informers. However, everyone who's engaged in nefarious activities or illegal activities wants very much to find out who the informers are. So that means the informers don't want to be seen in contact with the police. Therefore, the police, for example, will sometimes hold a dragnet. On the occasion of a big crime or something, they'll hold a dragnet which gives them a chance to bring each hundreds of people into the office individually. At that point, the informer can now tell what he needs to tell without having made any explicit connection or made a visible connection with him, because everybody knows he has to be there. So they're not noticeably singled out. However, the police have the informer in a vice, because they can always make an intentional slip that will reveal the informer. And the informer knows this and what a dangerous game he's playing. However, the informer has the police partly under his control, because he can use selective or fabricated information to affect the police's behavior, eliminating an enemy, closing down a rival ring, etc. He may also get money from the police and tease them with more information. So this is the kind of plex that results from our beings who see each other, beings who threaten each other, beings who make promises, and beings who can be cajoled. So that is what, so if you begin with Schelling's 1960 book, The Strategy of Conflict, that's an extremely simple model, but that's tied to game theory. You see, I don't understand why strategics is still tied to game theory, because game theory in its classic sense is between two parties who are not allowed to communicate and who are absolute enemies. And there are very few situations in the world that are like that. Schelling, in the book The Strategy of Conflict, pointed out in game theoretical language, so the economists would listen, that there were other situations where communication and shared payoffs were extremely important. So I see this is a work in progress, the modeling and representation of situations and maneuvers and self-revelation and as structures. Now, does this lead to anything practical? Yes. I'm going to repeat now a proposal which I made 20 years ago. It was published in Whole Earth Review. No one liked it. Maybe I said it wrong. Say it again. Millions of lives hang in the balance. No one pays attention. We are in the grip of an epidemic whose epicenters started around the Katanga War in the Congo, called AIDS, of a strange virus no one ever saw before. A slow venereal disease, slow and fatal venereal disease, which has infected millions, perhaps tens of millions of people worldwide. And the press use this very strange way of talking about it. When they say the rate has gone down, what they mean is the rate of increase has gone down, but it still ain't good. Now, there is an evolutionary principle that diseases become milder. So, for example, syphilis, which is suspected of having appeared slightly after Columbus, was far more virulent when it first appeared and very rapidly fatal, and now it's gotten much more moderate. We are now witnessing people with AIDS who have no symptoms, who are immune, and live much longer than they did in the 80s. I have one HIV positive friend in California who got along without drugs for 15 years. I think he's on them now, but he's very optimistic. So the point is that there are people are sloppy, The medical profession is naive. The medical profession, most doctors have not lived wild lives. And so they don't know the kind of sexual behavior that's out there. Another example, I had a friend in graduate school named Ed Lauman. I told him a few things I knew about street sex, not from firsthand. And his hair stood on end. He became the successor to Dr. Kinsey, carrying out the Kinsey Institute research in the 1990s. So the point is that a lot of people in authority don't know how wild human behavior can get. And so imagine, for example, that they imagine that simple rules will help. So general strategics is very much about strategic self-revelation. And the question is there anything we can do to create a contact curtain between those who are infected with HIV and those who are not? That's the objective. Not to blame anybody, not to be moralistic, just to create a contact curtain. My proposal is very simple, but first of all, let's look at how HIV tests are usually conducted. For example, anonymous testing in the States. You sign in anonymously giving some funny name. You give blood, you make an appointment for results. You have to go in for the results alone. You do not get a piece of paper. And so either they tell you, yes, you passed, you're okay, or no, you've got it, and further counseling is required. And all they give you when you leave is a lollipop and a condom. So how can you demonstrate to a potential partner that you're okay? There is no way. Now, you can see the logic here. They do not want it to be possible for you to be compelled to reveal your HIV status. And so, for example, employers might want to know, and they have no right. Lots of people who have no right might want to know. But unfortunately, that means you can't reveal it to someone you want to reveal it to. So here's the proposal. Now, it is legal, by the way. I didn't know this 20 years ago. It is legal, apparently, for anybody to give tests and for them to give the results out in any way they choose. So that this is just a proposal for an alternative method of revealing the test. And it's a system, and it's an example of strategic self-revelation. Here's the plan. We give out pendants. We give out pendants to everybody. And what they say is, let us stop the epidemic. Let us try to reinforce a contact curtain. Okay? That's all it is. Like the old red ribbons they had for the same purpose 20 years ago, but then they got to having gray ribbons, pink ribbons, and it got lost. So anybody can get a pendant. You take the test, and you pass it, you know what I mean, HIV negative. And everyone knows, okay, it's still a 6-month latency. It means what it means. If you pass it, your pendant's a little different. Not visibly, but if unscrewed, you can look through it, a hologram, got your picture, your name, HIV negative on such and such a date. If you fail the test, if you're HIV positive, you get the plain pendant. So what this does is that it's intended everybody should wear these pendants, dogs, old people. It is intended to say, let's be aware of this epidemic. It's everywhere. And if somebody really wants to know, we say, don't show it without cause. But if for a prospective fiancé or lover, then you open it. Now, for strategic self-revelation, this is a constructed system like the system of quitting smoking, like the Moscow-Washington hotline, which has certain objectives and is constructed a certain way. Since there's no negative, there's no way to prove that you have it from any of the pendants, that part is lost. All you can do is prove it's positive, and if you don't show a positive one, you say, well, I've got it at home and it's none of your business, because it isn't. So, I'm glad I got that one stated, because I wish this could have more effect. Last topic. Speaking of dark possibilities, we recently visited a friend of mine in the States named Don Jewett, a retired scientist. No, he's a practicing scientist. He's retired from some department. And he's gotten terribly interested in exploding planets. Now, he's a proponent of the Fred Hoyle theory of steady-state universe, and the Fred Hoyle theory of the steady-state universe included exploding planets. The notion of panspermia, that planets would explode and their tiniest life forms, the ones which could stand vacuum and so on, would disperse through space to yet other planets. And since Hoyle thought the universe was steady state, it wasn't like everything counting from the Big Bang, which is only, what, billion years ago. It's been going on ever so long, and therefore life only had to start in one place to get to here eventually. That's the theory, anyway. More recently, there's an astronomer named Tom Van Flandern, you might like his website, who is a serious peer-review published type of astronomer, but also very much interested in exploding planets. And he claims that, I believe, 3 planets have exploded in the solar system, giving us the asteroid belt and a lot of the dangerous things that fly past us now and then, like Shoemaker-Levy. So the question is, what might be the mechanism of exploding planets? A couple of years ago, there was a cover story in New Scientist about saying that maybe we have nuclear something or other inside the planet, but it was quite vague. And I came up with a hypothesis, once again, a hypothesis that is kind of interesting and kind of alarming. So here we are at the Earth. That is the representation of a cross-section of the Earth. And the Earth, by the standard theory, begins with the crust on which we romp, underneath which is the level of magma that the continents slide around on, according to the theory of Wegener, whom I showed you. And a couple layers below that is the nickel-iron core. The nickel-iron core. Now, isn't it interesting that we have solid, liquid, solid? Very strange. Now let's turn to another topic. There was, just after Wegener proposed moving continents, there was Hilgenberg. And Hilgenberg said, no, wait a minute. They're not sliding around. Just look. Look at how the continental shelves fit together. The continents aren't moving. The Earth is expanding. And all the mountains and so on are stretch marks. Now, this has been taken as generally nonsensical, although there's a cabal of people on the internet who make these nice maps. There's some very nice maps that look awfully plausible, but come on, how could the Earth expand? Let us return to the nickel-iron core. The nickel-iron core was proposed by, what's her name here? Miss Later. Yeah. Inge Lehmann in 1936. And how do we know it's there? Well, this is because of the various reflective, well, that doesn't say it quite right, but the various reflective properties. So essentially there's an acoustic reflection from the surface of the nickel-iron core. And then there's the magnetic field of the Earth, which only something like iron is going to be strong enough to maintain. Or is it? Well, perhaps some of you have guessed where I'm going. And alas, it turns out somebody else thought of it first. Someone named Owen. Hugh Owen, 1983. Postulated that this inner section, which has a well-defined acoustic boundary and stuff like that, is not a liquid, is not a solid. It's plasma. And it's a nuclear reactor which is moving all that magma. Something's putting in that energy. But it's a well-damped nuclear reactor, the mix of whose neutrons and protons and whatnot seems just right to keep it all from going off. But as it eats away, and this was not in Owen, my contribution here is to say, if so, perhaps it's eating away at the exterior to get bigger and bigger, thus giving us the expansion that is making the world bigger and bigger and will eventually blow us all to hell. I just think an exploding planet could ruin your whole day. So let's hope that's wrong. But I wanted to get it on the record just in case I could be proven right abstractly as we all go in all directions. Do I have time to talk about mathematics? Probably. Okay, yeah, mathematics. Remember I was talking about a cafeterium for learning instead of curriculum. Now, if it works, if it can be made for math, made to work for math, it can be made for anything. So, I'll just pull this plug so you won't be reading it. So, mathematics is hidden from us. Mathematics is the worst taught subject in the curriculum, I think. The teaching of mathematics took its present form, I'm told, in about 1890, when they decided that first you have arithmetic, then you have algebra, then you have geometry taught just the way Plato taught it. Is it Plato? Euclid. And then more algebra, and this and that, and then finally the calculus, after which you're considered to have mathematical maturity, and you're allowed to find out about the stuff that's interesting. In other words, it is meant to blockade everyone from enjoying what should be there, what they should see. Mathematics is a crystalline universe of cross-connection. I'm not a mathematician, but I know that much. Everything is as intertwingled in mathematics as could possibly be. And yet, they always do it in a fixed sequence. Now, what happened with the new math in the 1960s? I don't know if you had that in England, but in the States, The new math derived everything from set theory, but it was still one fixed sequence. Do you get it? Do you see what's wrong? Topics. There's a psychologist named Piaget, who everybody takes for some great humanist. I think he's a jerk. Because he thinks that, no, the fixed sequence taught by the schools is all wrong. You should use the fixed sequence that his Swiss children used. So once again, it's that same notion. All these elaborate educational committees trying to work out the perfect curriculum. Wrong! The perfect curriculum is no curriculum. Meaning, an explorable whole in which each person can find the parts he or she likes, learning it in any order. You can eventually have to learn it all, okay? Take that for history first. If I say to you, find some guy in history you find really appealing. Now write him up. Okay, now do another. Now summarize a millennium. But follow your interests first. It'll turn out to be far different than if you have to do it in the order that it's done now. Same thing for mathematics. The following topics should all be available at a simple level, available and accessible and testable. Vectors, matrices, constraints, groups, fields, graphs, topology, category theory. What's category theory? Okay. When I was 6, I think, why is it that a positive number plus a positive number is positive and a negative number plus a negative number is positive? Doesn't make sense. That's category theory. And I believe some small amount of it could be created that the 6-year-old could deal with. And for all of these things. So here is my agenda for mathematics, to create not a curriculum but a lattice of materials which can be explored in any order. And for God's sake, to get arithmetic out of the way and stop calling it mathematics. Because the fact that kids hate arithmetic should not be allowed to block their understanding of the higher stuff. Well, so I guess that's it. I'll make one more point about intertwingularity. That is that when Marlene was first going out with me, she thought she'd research me. So she read my book, Computer Lib, and she got to the page where I said everything was deeply intertwingled, and she moved in. So that just goes to show it's useful. Okay.